Hey everybody, this is the we're trying to think of a new name for this. Maybe this is going to be Ethicsverse Overtime, Ethicsverse After Hours. There were so many great comments in the chat. We wanted to spend a couple extra minutes making sure we got to them. So we have Karen Moore and the coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. And so we're going to be going through all those extra questions from the chat.
Sure. So yes, everybody who's listening or watching, these are the questions that came to us from our quarterly ethics and compliance review, which I think we had on August 1st. And we got a ton of questions. We did not have enough time for them. So I pulled together a list of, I think, about a half a dozen questions that Karen and Nick, I wanted to pose to you all that we can still keep working through them. And I'll just fire them off in the order that they happen to kind of arrive in and be received. The first person had asked, should a whistleblower process within the company, I presume that means the internal reporting system, should that specifically state some sort of service level agreement for responses and follow-up updates back to the whistleblower? Karen, I'll pose that to you first. What do you think of that? And then Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think first of all, you have to start with some transparency in your process anyway. So there needs to be some clear guidelines and communications and information that all the participants in an investigation can kind of hang the investigation, hang their role on. Because I think sometimes investigations, they naturally take a while. And if you're a witness or a reporter and or God forbid, the subject of the investigation, not knowing what the timeline is going to be is a kind of tough one. So I think, first of all, there's got to be kind of a transparent process document or ability to explain. But then I do think there need to be targets because investigations can carry out infinitum. So I always say that you've got to match the amount of time you're spending on an investigation to the severity of the investigation itself. But you've got to bring it to a conclusion. Life has to go on, the business has to operate. And so I think just general targets, maybe not actual service level, but targets of, say, 30 days for a routine investigation and maybe 90 days for something more complex, gives you something to aim at and gives a framework for people to understand what to expect. And then, of course, we've got, in some cases, some deadlines that are baked into the process. And the whole EE Whistleblower Directive provides deadlines and by which things need to be done. Some of them maybe not that realistic. But yes, I think that there needs to be some sort of timing mechanism to frame the investigation.
Nick, what do you think?
I would say that the way that a company interacts with those who are speaking up sends a couple of messages. And I think the more you can do to, as Karen said, build transparency into that process and let people know what they should expect, the better. So whether that's like an infographic on your portal that shows kind of those average steps or just checkpoints that, every 2 weeks or every 30 days, we're going to follow up with reporters and let them know that, hey, we haven't forgotten about you. We're still working on it. I just think something to kind of manage those expectations along the way can do a lot to build trust. And that's kind of what the name of the game is, right? If we're going to be getting this risk intelligence from people, they need to kind of know, the more people who know what to expect from a process, the more likely somebody is to participate in it.
Yeah, I would just add that better not to do it than to promise that you will and botch that. So you think long and hard about what are your resources? Do you have the right technology to be able to do this? But I also think that, I don't want to say people are making a mountain out of a molehill, but whistleblowers are human beings. And I think if you just treat them as such, you'd be surprised at how accommodating they can be. They really want to know that they're being heard. And that's all. And you could even just tell them, we're looking into this. It's going to take a long time. And we'll drop you a couple of follow-ups where we might very well say, we're still working on it. I've always thought whistleblowers would be amenable to that because that's all they want, is they just want to know somebody is listening. And we've talked about that in the Ethicsverse numerous times in the past.
I'm going to just put one caveat on that, though, Matt, which is that sometimes whistleblowers feel that they're entitled to know all of the steps in the investigation, including the substance and the outcome. Fair. And sometimes even the outcome isn't something that you can readily share with the whistleblower. And if the whistleblower himself or herself hasn't been harmed by the underlying misconduct, you might say they don't really have a right to know too much about the outcome. And there may be all sorts of reasons you don't share that. So that communication, that tightrope needs to be walked as well.
Yeah, but again, you could do a lot to kind of get out ahead of that in terms of like how much about the process you share and what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, in terms of like infographics or, process overviews that are provided to employees. But then also when you're talking to that individual, Matt, to your point, I just find people to be like pretty reasonable. And, if they think they're entitled to something, and there's a valid reason for them not to be entitled to that information or some conclusion, then I just think explaining the why behind it, I think most people are kind of amenable to it. And just by their nature, I just find like the people who speak up are the people who are, they're kind of willing to stick their neck out in pursuit of like something, bigger than themselves. Not to romanticize it too much, because there are people who speak up about stealing, my sriracha or something like that from the fridge. But like, I just think these are kind of guardians of the culture. These are people who are, largely conscientious. And, to your point, I think they just want to be heard and treated like a human being. Just one other thing that you said, I just think we got to underscore, like, I think so many times in this industry, we let like perfect be the enemy of like good, or perfect be the enemy of like good enough. Like, you just have to kind of get going. And if you can't sign up for, if you can't sort of convey, this is what every single step of this investigation process is going to be, you don't have to know all that. You just need to have some kind of, share something, give them some kind of glimpse into that process, I think. And a lot of that trust can be built and like maintained as that investigation is happening.
Yeah, I think 100% there, Nick. It's not, it's not a legal burden of proof that we have here to beyond a reasonable doubt, or, even preponderance of the evidence. You've got to move an investigation pace towards a conclusion that works for everybody, for all the parties.
So here's the next question, and I think this stems from our discussion on August 1st about Boeing and the plea agreement that it had reached, where prosecutors were basically ordering Boeing's ethics and compliance function and its safety and product quality teams to, if not merge, at least work in a much more highly integrated manner. So somebody was asking, how would a chief compliance officer effectively lead the safety function at a high level? That appears to be a risk. Karen, what do you think about that first?
Yeah, I agree 100%. You'd have to give the compliance officer a whole huge set of extra team to be able to do something like that. An average compliance officer is not going to be a health and safety expert. I have a huge amount of respect for the people that work in health and safety. It's a specialty field all of its own. So I don't think it should be owned by compliance, but I do think that the compliance structure, the compliance mechanism for surfacing issues, for investigating concerns, for working on some sort of kind of risk assessment process that could be useful for health and safety, managing some overall policies and training, or being involved in some of the training. I mean, make use of that compliance structure to handle a whole huge important area like health and safety, or frankly, a lot of other things that people think, oh, maybe compliance should be in charge of, which compliance maybe shouldn't be in charge of, like artificial intelligence and some of the ESG, other components outside of health and safety. Compliance doesn't have to own things in order to be able to provide really good, strong structural support.
And Nick, let me put it to you this way, that I think Karen raises a good point that, yes, you might need more staff and resources, but if you're a company of any appreciable size where safety is an issue, you have that. There is an environmental health and safety team out there somewhere. And this is really more about getting the EHS team and everybody else just to talk about when things are not going according to plan, which was Boeing's ultimate problem. There was product safety issues being covered up. And that can be compliance officer's problem, because that is what the compliance function is about. It's about, getting the bad stuff out so we can look at it and try and clean it up. So, I mean, that's how I look at it. But Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm a compliance imperialist. So I just feel like they should be over everything. In my mind, EHS, to the extent it exists, I just think it is a compliance thing at kind of its highest level. And I think the existence of it in like as its own entity or its own department within an organization is a function of what risks that organization is dealing with. Obviously, manufacturing companies have a lot, much higher sort of environmental health and safety risk than like the average sort of office based organization. And so, this thing has sort of grown into its own thing. But I just think at the end of the day, compliance is all about like business quality. It's, we have these rules we have to follow. We have these these regulations we have to meet. We have these policies we need to adhere to, and compliance is sort of there to help the business adhere to those things in sort of a more efficient way. And, this just seems like a little bit of a different flavor. And I would say to your point, let me give you this story. So I used to work like in private equity, and one of our portfolio companies that was one of our top performers, they did this, they had this really interesting thing that they did. They had it was a decision-making framework that was applied throughout the organization. And so they had a hurdle rate. There was a certain return that they wanted to generate for any investment they did, whether that was a new department or like a new plant, or it was an acquisition or whatever the organization was doing. They had this sort of 3X rule that they wanted to be able to, like, every dollar should generate $3. And so when people in the organization were armed with this algorithm, they could apply that sort of consistently for all these different decisions, whether it was to, like I said, pull up, make an investment for a new manufacturing line or whatever. And so I think there was a lot of power and there was a lot of value generated from the adoption and digestion of this algorithm that was able to be applied across the organization. And really what that algorithm was at its core, it was just it was really like a risk, it was a risk algorithm. It's like, okay, we're willing to take on this risk if we think the expected value is 3X of it. And so it's just kind of a corollary for this concept of like a consistent application of a risk management framework, that if an organization can get that right, and that can sort of cascade and fractalize across the organization in these different departments that have their own sort of mandate or their own sort of goal, then I think there's a lot of de-risking of the entire platform that comes along with it. You know what I'm saying? It's like a similar framework that's applied. So I know that's not like a perfect thing, but I think I think it's at least potentially analogous. You know what I'm saying? Analogous. It's potentially analogous to what a compliance team can do, to the extent that they are over ESG, environmental health and safety or whatever. They have that sort of bird's eye view of all these potential hotspots in the organization, and can potentially apply a risk management framework that could more consistently root out sort of bad risk sooner,
Okay. Now, next question. When should a company admit that there was a screw up? Which I think is this person's rather casual way of saying, when should the company voluntarily self-disclose a compliance violation? But also, how do non-disclosure agreements enter into that equation? Karen, what do you think?
Well, we've already seen some, I guess the SEC has coined this pre-taliation phrase. So we've already seen a couple of SEC actions where non-disclosure agreements or some sort of prior agreement with employees would either prevent them from cooperating, or at least by their wording suggests that it would prevent them from cooperating with the authorities, or prevent them from benefiting from any kind of whistleblowing activity. And the SEC's come out pretty firmly, I think, to say that, no, you can't do that. I like to give a little benefit of the doubt to say sometimes these non-disclosure agreements are just intended to keep people quiet generally and not go out and talk too much to the press or in public, but that of course maybe there's this understanding that if there's a court order or a regulatory body that has authority that's going to ask for information, that you should always cooperate. But I think it's a mistake not to anticipate that and bake that also into your investigations protocols and your communications and the way that you handle a whistleblower or an employee who has a concern, so that they can understand where their rights are and where they aren't. What can they say, what can they not say, but also that cooperation with the authorities is always something the company would like to be able to manage, but also would never try to stifle where there's a legal obligation.
Yeah. And I should say that I can think of, within the last 2 weeks, I saw a news story of one of the world's largest shipping companies. Go down to your nearest dockyards and you look around, you'll see the shipping company I'm thinking of. They were in trouble with the Labor Department for retaliation agreements. So this is not exclusive to the SEC. And I know that various states now prohibit NDAs if the issue isn't a compliance violation, but more like a civil litigation over sexual harassment. You can't impose an NDA on the harassed employee. So NDAs are a lot more complicated than what people would think. Nick, what are your thoughts or observations about this decision on when to self-disclose an issue?
On Ethicsverse Day, Hui Chen kind of gave, I think, a little bit of a controversial answer. At least it seemed controversial based on the response from the chat, where she was just saying, like, it kind of depends, and you shouldn't always, make that report. She told a story about, I think she anecdotally told a story how somebody came and self-reported, and everybody on her side was like, why are they here? We would have never found this. So I think I think there's perhaps sort of two approaches to take. One is just sort of a black and white approach, and one is the gray. The gray is obviously a little bit more kind of amorphous and maybe, less clear. The black and white thing is to say, anytime there's something, we want to just report it because those are our values. That's a little bit easier, but you might kind of run into a situation where, you're reporting something unnecessarily, or you're getting, a penalty that you wouldn't otherwise have gotten. I think what Hui Chen would say, or what she said on that day, was it's really kind of an expected value exercise to say, like, okay, what are the odds they find out about it? If they find out about it, what's going to be the impact of it versus us self-reporting, and what that sort of reduced amount would be. And then it's kind of a, an expected value exercise, or, that kind of a calculation. So I don't really have that great of an answer. I think it's a little bit easier to just kind of think, all right, well, it's black and white. Anytime there's something, I want to sort of show myself as a willing participant, or somebody who's cooperative. But I think that can cause you to perhaps like get yourself into trouble, unnecessarily.
I wanted to pull on one extra thread here, that if I am remembering correctly, I think about 2 hours after we had our original August 1st Ethicsverse session, the Justice Department announced its new whistleblower awards program.
Yes.
Where the department said, if an internal person brings a concern to the compliance team, you then have about 120 days to decide whether or not you should take it to the Justice Department, you, the company. Basically, they were saying if somebody reports it internally first and then brings it to us, the Justice Department, and we have not yet followed up with you, company, if you bring it to us within 120 days, even though we already know about it because the internal person came to us, you'll still get the self-disclosure credit. And I always thought that actually what they're really telling us is, what is timely self-disclosure of an incident? It's 120 days. They don't flat out say that, but they had pretty much said, if you don't do it in 120 days and you bring it later on, you won't get the credit. So I've always thought that was a big reveal.
Big reveal, and it feels reasonable.
Yes. Karen, what do you think about this too?
I think it does feel reasonable, but I also just really wonder about what the Department of Justice is going to do when that clock starts ticking. The whistleblower comes to them on day one. Are they going to wait 119 more days and just see if somebody shows up at the door before they take action? Or are they going to pick up the phone and say, hey, we know about this? So, that's kind of one side I'm a little bit curious about. The other thing that concerns me a tiny bit is that it does a little bit force the company's hand. Now, I think that Wei Chen and I are not on the same page in terms of the strategic value of not self-disclosing, because I think as a compliance officer, the company should come clean. And if you do self-disclose under the new self-disclosure rules, that you're headed towards a declination. So, you may have to disgorge illegally gained profits, but I think that's a cleansing opportunity for a company that's engaged in misconduct, hopefully somewhat inadvertently. That is, so hopefully it's not part of the DNA of the company to have engaged in that misconduct. So, but I do think that, with this whistleblower bounty, the 120 days, you do kind of force the company's hand. Now they really have to make a self-disclosure, and they have to do it maybe more quickly than they're ready to do, because 120 days, it's not huge. The whistleblower may have gone in really early with a very light supposition. They don't have to have, if I understand the policy, they don't have to substantial file there. So just a reasonable belief. So the timing seems a little bit, I'd like to see how that ends up playing out. But otherwise, I think it's a great thing. I think it still can get companies to show to their potential whistleblower the value of coming in internally first, so that at least the disclosure to the authorities doesn't come as a surprise.
I would say, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, though, like, a company doesn't know if that whistleblower went to the authorities. So they also don't know like how much time then is on that clock. So
Well,
does it actually provide any kind of benefit to the company? Like,
it would. So it's 120 days from when the whistleblower reports internally first. So
when it reports internally. Okay.
So you have to assume at the company, like, okay, we've been notified. We have to assume that on their way home from work, they called the Justice Department too. And I mean, you might as well err on the side of that caution and then figure out what you want to do.
But I guess the application of that algorithm, this 120-day algorithm, you have to kind of apply to any case that could potentially have been sort of reported to the Justice Department, right? I mean, to get the benefit, to get the implicit benefit to your company, you have to do that assumption, I think, to your point.
I would say the only two cases I can think of that help clarify this are Cognizant Technologies, which I think it was back in 2019. They had a egregious FCPA violations. Senior executives were bribing millions to government officials in India. They disclosed this matter to the Justice Department within 2 weeks of them finding it out. Now, there is no way they knew where this would end up within 2 weeks. I'm confident of that. But it was the right thing to do. And so when it was resolved, they got a lot of credit and a very reasonable fine given the gravity of what happened. And then there was another FCPA settlement, I want to say within the last 6 months or so, but I can't remember the company. But I do recall that the Justice Department said they waited 18 months to voluntarily self-disclose.
Albemarle, I think.
Yeah, it was.
It might have been Albemarle, but the department clearly said it ain't that. That's not timely. You know,
that was not timely, right?
We had some extreme markers on either side, but this, I think, really, like 4 months is enough to figure out what are we going to do, even though we don't know exactly how this is going to end up.
Well, and it's important to understand that 120 days doesn't mean that the company's got to complete an investigation within that short time period. We just, need to start having that conversation, which I think, once you're reasonably comfortable with the scope of what you're dealing with, to me, it's a good thing to have a collaborative, cooperative relationship with the DOJ, which is shown willing to, come to some reasonable outcome here. Also getting back to our very first conversation about transparency with whistleblowers, I think you want to encourage people to report first, and then you want to have that conversation to find out, are they going to be going to the authorities? They don't have to tell you, but wouldn't it be great to say, this is so great that you came to us. We know you may be considering going and reporting this outside. Have some confidence in us over the next few weeks while we kind of get our internal investigation together. We'd love for you to kind of work with us on that. We're not telling you can't go. We kind of support you going. Maybe we go together. I don't even know if that's a possibility under this new regime. Can the company self-disclose and bring in the whistleblower at the same time who's saying, yeah, I'm also making a report here. Give me a cut of the outcoming fines. I don't know. That would be interesting, wouldn't it?
That would be interesting. Yeah.
Next question. Somebody writing in, I'm curious why managers should be incentivized to model ethical behavior rather than that being the base level expectation. I've heard this question asked many times over the years, and I still struggle with what a good answer is. Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, I love the question because it's one that I've asked so many times. I was in a company where the performance evaluations had what was supposed to be a very objective evaluation of a bunch of different competencies, and you were supposed to say underperform, perform, or exceed expectations, right? So you kind of had three choices, and one of them, which was great, was kind of ethical conduct and working with integrity. And I said, how can you exceed that? If we say that one of our core values is integrity, how do you say that somebody's outperformed? I mean, I suppose if they've bent over backwards to uncover something and maybe reported it, you might say that, but saying meets expectations should be a pretty high bar already. So I kind of start there and I struggle with it. I struggle with the whole kind of rewards for good ethics behavior because it should be part and parcel of what people do. So all of these, kind of special awards, and nobody's going to want a certificate on their wall that says, "Hey, I blew the whistle." But I don't have a good answer. Sorry, I'm going around in circles. I don't know how you exceed expectations if your expectations are really high.
All right, Nick, do you have a good answer?
We'll see. So, I mean, it's not actually a prerequisite because it's not like common everywhere. You know what I'm saying? Like it should be, integrity should be table stakes for anybody in a leadership position, but just the fact that there are tons of people in leadership positions without it means that it's something to like, I don't know how to say it. Like we want it. We want to encourage it. It's not like a foregone conclusion that you're going to get it just by the nature of someone being in that position. Just because you are a father, you fathered a child doesn't mean that you're a loving father, although you should be. So I get the, like, why should we be encouraging behavior that's like expected, that's part of the job? But then on the human side of it, like, it just seems like, in my experience, like you have to reinforce, you have to apply positive reinforcement to the behaviors you want to see. And that seems to have 5, 10, 20 times the impact of like the negative reinforcement. And so I think we're all wired as human beings where we have good days, bad days, things we struggle with, things we have strengths in. And it's just not a foregone conclusion that we can flip that switch, or you go through management training and then you're just a high integrity person. The question itself said that, why should they be incentivized to model the ethical behavior? I mean, you can spin that the other way and say, I have an incentive to make sure that my managers understand the benefit of ethical behavior for themselves. And if I can do that, then that's going to create like an inherent or an internal incentive for them to progress their career by talking about ethics more, for example. So go ahead.
I think that is the right way to go about it. I got hung up on the practicalities of what do these incentive or disincentive programs look like anyways? Because if you are giving rewards to the middle manager for having a great ethical team, I could easily see the middle manager turning around and saying, we're not going to report anything to anybody at senior management. And when I get the bonus, you guys get 10%. Or if you're punishing them for a ethics infraction, they could turn around to their team and say, if you speak up, I will wring your neck because it's going to be my job. And like, I don't know how this works in practice. Although, Nick, as soon as you said demonstrating to them why ethical behavior is good for their own success anyways, like that I get. But I don't know, maybe if listeners out there have some observations on this, we should do a whole Ethicsverse on it sometime down the road, because I don't know what this looks like in practice.
So let's just talk about incentives. Like, when we hear about incentives, we tend to think about dollars, and that's like a very explicit, tangible incentive. But like, there's also an incentive conveyance when I compliment somebody, or you compliment a behavior of mine, or I, hold somebody up as an example. Those are obviously less like monetary incentives, but those are still behaviors that are being, that are attempted to be reinforced. You know what I mean? And I think, I don't know, like, I expect my kids to be very polite, but also when they are polite, I want to encourage that and reinforce it and tell them that I'm proud of them when they meet somebody new and they look them in the eye and they shake their hand, like, I expect that for sure. And, I don't know, it's the incentive thing, because the way it's asked almost implies like, yep, I'm paying out gift cards to guys for like not like violating our code of conduct. And I just think like that's kind of a minimum adherence. Where we're really trying to go is like, we want these people to be models of these things. And I think it's okay to incentivize that. And it's okay to hold people up as examples of, a leader who's doing that or living out those kinds of values,
Well, and maybe we break it down into other attributes like trust and respect, so that when you do employee surveys, for example, if you as a manager get really high scores to questions or statements like, I trust my manager, or my manager respects me, or, maybe those are the kinds of measures that we should be looking at, rather than is somebody acting with integrity or modeling integrity. I've seen too many managers really blow it when employees have concerns and try and raise those concerns with their managers, as they're told to do, and then the managers don't know what to do with it. So maybe those are the measures that we should be looking at, not focusing so much on acting with integrity, because if you don't act with integrity, you shouldn't be working there anymore.
Well, I would even go as far to say is like, I mean, the question itself, and maybe I'm getting a little technical here, but like, it says, why should managers be incentivized to model ethical behavior rather than being the base level expectation? And I just think like, well, that incentive exists. That incentive exists in the free market. It exists on the individual level. It exists on the company level. Like, I believe our company has an incentive to be an ethical company, because I think that the harvest is going to come from, sowing the right kind of seeds. I think the same thing is true in terms of like leadership, like, you can be an ethical leader, you can be an ethical vendor or an ethical client, whatever. I think those lead in general to better outcomes. And so there's an incentive system kind of like underpinning all of this, where, I mean, we see it in the most ethical companies all the time. I talk about this ethical premium all the time. That incentive exists. That exists for anyone if they want to, if they want to, authentically pursue, a high integrity life or a high integrity business,
Okay.
Yeah, Nick, you're a very enlightened leader, though. I've seen, unfortunately, too many examples where a high delivering salesperson, for example, will be hired and promoted and coddled because of their ability to deliver, and the integrity side of things may be a little bit shaky.
That's a good point.
So last question here. When a whistleblower lacks support from top management, the process can be exploited by middle management level employees to settle personal scores. This undermines fairness and transparency, as investigations may become biased, lack independence, and violate the principles of natural justice. They don't actually end with a question there, but I mean, they certainly have raised a pretty good pointed issue about for the problem with top management, where they're disengaged with the speak up culture. I don't know if either one of you have thoughts about this, but Karen, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, and messages have got to come trickling down from the top. They can't come sideways in, and they can't be only from the compliance department. So the importance of integrity and investigations has got to be supported by senior management, and that obligation to participate and respect the process. That signal has got to come trickling down through the organization. I think it's a little unfair to always call out middle management, because I think they're under the greatest amount of pressure. On the other hand, I've also been on my soapbox several times about microcultures within organizations, which you see time and time again, where some middle manager, kind of creates his or her own fiefdom, and people become, Stockholm syndromized to that microculture and don't feel like they have the ability to get out of it. But I think once things are in an investigations process, there should be little or no role for middle management. In fact, I usually in an investigation kind of cut middle management out a little bit until we know the depth and scope of the underlying misconduct, because sometimes it implicates middle management. So you have to kind of treat them as potential subjects of the matter as well. So I think that the statement is not inaccurate. But I also think that, the investigations process needs to tackle that just head on.
I would say, I think a lot of this is not, we shouldn't pick on middle management unfairly, although we should pick on them when they deserve it, which is sometimes. But I'm always struck, but I think at large organizations, the top level and the bottom level are generally in agreement that they want to speak up culture. And really, this isn't, we always like to say this isn't all about middle management, but it's more specifically, how does senior management engage with the middle management? Because middle managers are just going to do whatever the senior managers tell them to. And if they get the impression senior management wants me to have a stifling culture of retribution, they're going to do that. Or if senior management wants me to have a speak up culture, I'm going to do that. And really, that's it. It's not the bottom level and how they interact with the middle. It's the top and how they interact with the middle, I think. But Nick, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the stage is set, and the leader, top level leadership is going to set some kind of a vibe, and they are going to convey what's important to them with their behaviors. And those behaviors are going to have a lot more of an impact than the words that they say. And so if if top leadership with the middle manager group has a vibe of, I want you guys to speak up, I need to hear about, problems, things like that, well, then that's going to influence those folks. I just think as a leader, whether it's a team or it's an entire business, like, how are you not trying to open all the floodgates to get as much insight, as much risk intelligence? You know what I'm saying? Like, you have thousands of eyes in many cases in your organization, and these eyes are attached to human beings. It's not attached to a sensor. If you can turn those on, there's so much more that you can see. There's so much more you can react to so much faster. I just think it's like the most important thing, whether you're running a team or you're running a business, to set that kind of a, turn that speak up culture up to 11, man. I mean, there's just so much out there, and you can sort through that. You can see what's important and what's not, but we just run the risk of sending a mixed signal if we're not sending a really clear signal. And that mixed signal is likely going to be turning down that speak up culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So those are all the questions we had for this episode of the Ethicsverse Overtime or After Dark or whatever we wind up calling it. But
We'll
we
see what
covered
we land on. But this was so fun, man. This was great. I appreciate you guys coming on. Yeah, I think it's cool to be able to like dive into this and really chew on some of these questions because there are some really great ones. So I appreciate you guys doing it. Hopefully we can do it again soon. And we will see you next Thursday at noon.